Well, good morning. It was great to see everyone yesterday, and welcome back to day 2 of the California Dyslexia Initiative Conference. I'm Tammy Wilson, and I'm the project lead for the California Dyslexia Initiative. We are thrilled to welcome over 2,500 educators with partners from across California, many other states, and even some international colleagues. So yesterday was a great day. We learned so much from our keynote, Dr. Marianne Wolf, and from all of the breakout sessions, and we're really excited to continue that learning today. Today, we have the great pleasure of learning from not one, but 2 outstanding educators during our keynote, Dr. Elsa Cárdenas-Hagan and Dr. Julia Kovelman. Dr. Elsa Cárdenas-Hagan is a bilingual speech-language pathologist and a certified academic language therapist. She's the director of the Valley Speech, Language, and Learning Center in Brownsville, Texas, which was established in 1993. She also works with the Texas Institute for Measurement, Evaluation, and Statistics at the University of Houston. Dr. Cárdenas-Hagan is the author of Esperanza, Hope, a Spanish language program designed to assist students who are struggling with learning to read. Her research interests include the development of early reading assessments for Spanish-speaking students and the development of reading interventions for bilingual students. She was the co-principal investigator of a longitudinal study funded by the National Institute of Children's Health and Human Development and the Institution for Education Science that really looked at oracy and literacy development in English and Spanish for Spanish-speaking children. She serves as the vice president for the International Dyslexia Association and has authored curricular programs, book chapters, and journal articles related to oracy and literacy development for English learners. Dr. Julia Kovelman is a professor of psychology at the University of Michigan. Bilingualism changes the mind and the brain. And as a developmental cognitive neuroscientist, Dr. Kovelman uses both behavioral and neuroimaging methods to understand the effects of bilingualism on children's language, literacy, and brain development. In her current research, Dr. Kovelman focuses on bilingual children learning to read in typologically distinct languages, Spanish, English, and Chinese. These studies include experiments with typically developing readers and at-risk learners, such as those with dyslexia. Through this work, she addresses the universal, language-specific, and bilingual influences on children's reading development and dyslexia. I am really looking forward to hearing from and learning from this dynamic duo, Dr. Elsa Cárdenas-Hagan and Dr. Julia Kovelman, and I know that we're going to learn so much about meeting the needs of our multilingual learners. Welcome.
Thank you so very much. We'll get the slides right up for you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. It is a great pleasure to be with you today as part of this venue. And there's a quick introduction from Elsa and I today.
Yes, we always want to start with the why. Why do we do the work that we do? And that's me as a little kindergartner. I remember that hairspray that my aunt put on there. And I want to tell you my why. My why is when I was a little girl entering school for the very first time, the public school system, speaking Spanish as my home language. We were told that we were not to ever speak our home language in the school campus, not in the physical education classroom, and not during lunch hour. And very sadly, I took that to heart and didn't get to really use my home language until middle school, when you get to do what? Take a foreign language. And so my why is to make sure that every child that enters school, that they, and especially from diverse populations, that they are seen as an asset and that their home language gives so much to learning second and third languages. That's my why. How about you, Julia?
As you might be, As you might be hearing from my Russian accent, I have spilled out along with millions of others as the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 90s, and have spent most of my life in immigrant communities where people would speak a variety of languages, Moldavian, Ukrainian, Russian, Armenian, whatnot, along with other immigrants from Latin America, from China, from Asia. Millions of places, millions of languages spoken at home and different from the languages spoken at school. And so the question that I ask in these multilingual hubbub that the children are hearing, do these heritage languages make an influence on how the children learn to read and to speak in the academic languages of their schools, especially when those are different from their home languages? And when you think about United States, we don't usually think of the United States as a bilingual or even multilingual country, but look at this graph. Amazingly, we're right underneath India for the numbers of languages that we speak. And everybody knows that India is such a linguistically rich country where many languages are formally acknowledged languages. Nevertheless, here in the United States, it's a country that welcomes immigrants and historically is an immigrant country. And so we have this multitude of languages, and we want to know how these languages influence children's learning, how speaking these languages influences children's learning. And so the key questions we want to cover today are bilingual kids delayed in learning to speak and to read, right? There's something that parents and teachers and policymakers wonder about. How do we help kids? How do we identify and help kids with language and reading deficits? And how do we support all bilingual learners and especially at-risk learners with language and reading deficits? So our presentation today is broken into two parts. We're going to talk about language and reading. These are tightly interrelated. And so we will start with language. And the first question is, are bilingual children delayed in their dual language acquisition? That's a question I get a lot on the playgrounds, in the grocery stores, everywhere where you go. And mothers are holding their kids and speaking to them multiple languages. Everybody wants to know, well, is the kid going to be delayed? And this is the question that I was introduced to by my own PhD advisor, Laura-Ann Petito, who was looking at kids exposed to a spoken language, such as English, and a sign language, such as American Sign Language. And she was asking two questions. First, is for any reason speech is preference and preferential to a sign language? A sign language is an adaptation that we go through when the child is deaf. Or is our brain equally as built to acquire a spoken and sign language? To answer this question back in the 90s, one had to compare these kids to a bilingual population because we thought that bilingual kids are delayed and confused and don't process their languages. And so to understand if bilingual children, CODAs, children of deaf adults, are same or different from from spoken language bilingualism, one had to do the studies. And so if you want to read more about these works, they're published and posted for you. And the question is, well, we know that kids who are monolingual and exposed to only English or only Spanish or only Russian will go through a set of language acquisition stages. One of them is first words. We all marvel at about 12 months. Kids will go mama and maybe dada, whatever is their first word. Then they'll go through a two-word combination. My child said baby banana, and it denoted a yogurt that had a banana and a baby on it, right? These are two-word combinations. And then the vocabulary grows exponentially, and there'll be about 50 words at 24 months. That's what we know about monolingual children. How about bilingual kids? Are they the same, or are they behind these universal milestones in language acquisition? Well, let's take a look. First, we're going to take a look at a child who is a CODA. It means it's a child of deaf adults, and there's a spoken language, a parent who is hearing and speaks, and there's a parent who is deaf and sign, as well as a parent who speaks, and a bilingual child where the parents speak French and English. So this is in Canada. And we're looking at, for a French-English bilingual child, The child is reaching the first word milestone at about 1 year of age in both English and French. And so that's well within the monolingual range. Then we'll look at the two-word combination, right? Those baby bananas. And you see that again, this is well within the monolingual range. And so is the 50-word milestone. And then we turn, and apologize for the earlier confusion on the order. And now we turn to a child where one parent is deaf in signs and the other parent has some hearing and speaks. And again, the first word and a sign, a spoken language are coming in at the same time. And they're at the same time of each other. Notice how close they are in time for each other. And the two-word combinations and also the 50 words. So there's multiple important answers and messages here. First and foremost, if the child is exposed to two languages from early in life, they are not confused, they're not delayed. They're acquiring their language milestones at the same time as the monolingual children. They're acquiring their language milestones at the same time for both of their languages. And in case you wondered, speech is not privileged. Our brain is built for any natural human language, be that Spanish, English, French, Chinese or Hindi, or a natural sign language. So that, my friends, is for the delays or the lack of thereof. The next question we ask is, well, what about bilingual proficiency? There's just too much going on. English has very complex grammar. Spanish has a very complex grammar. Did you try studying Spanish? Try Chinese. These are complex languages, lots of words, lots of really complex grammar. Our brain, a child's brain is not a computer. Can it really handle it all? Well, this is the work from the ABLA lab, Dr. Lisa Bidor and Elizabeth Pena, and they asked this question by looking at kids with varying amounts of use for each language. Obviously, right, a child whose parents only speak English and the environment only makes English available, the child wakes up at 8 a.m., goes to bed at 10 p.m., and only hears English as their primary language. We then turn to a child who has some Spanish at home. Maybe the grandmother speaks Spanish, but everybody else speaks English. So now this child is English dominant. And look at this. This is a child, maybe this child is born in Texas and they're growing up in this bilingual community where historically the community had used both languages at the same time. They're 50-50. Half the day they speak English, hear English and speak English, and half the day they speak Spanish. That's the worst case scenario. Compared to a monolingual child who spends all day hearing and speaking English, now they speak half a day in each language. How in the world will this child learn to speak any language, right? When you have half the time of usage. Let's take a look. Are you ready? Are you ready with me? Here it comes. So we're only going to look at these 50-50 children, those what would say at risk, right? They're having only half the day in each language. What happens to them? Here's what happens. If we just look at their English, well, they're doing all right, right? Above the blue line, above the blue box, are the kids with typical, obviously, doing well on the English score. So in a clinical diagnostic world, we look at the kids right about the line of 85 on the standard scores, and so they're doing well. Some are falling below, but let's look at them in Spanish. Okay, again, the vast majority of the kids are above the pink zone, and they're doing really well, but some of them are in the pink zone. But now let's take a look at both languages, and this is what happens. Most of the kids are doing really well. They're doing well in English and they're doing well in Spanish. Look at that upper right quadrant where the kids are reaching their proficiency standards in both languages. In the purple box, which you see is a lot of red dots, those kids that have been identified as having language impairments, a history of language difficulties. These children need to see or are already seeing a speech pathologist. So if the child's doing poorly in both languages, you don't wait for them to get more English in, right? You call the school, the teacher, you ask to see a speech pathologist or a reading specialist. So that, my friends, is the answer to our question, right? So look at all the kids who are doing well. The bilingual children can perform, have proficiencies that is just as good in at least their dominant language, but possibly in both languages. And if they're not, they need to be seeing a specialist. I think I was introduced as a brain scientist here, and I haven't shown you any brain pictures yet. So here we go. Let's ask about the brain, right? We just talked about the complexity that it takes to learn big language systems, right? Spanish is complicated, Russian is complicated, Chinese is complicated, Hindi is complicated. Try taking a second language today. You will find yourself struggling through the exercises and vocabulary drills. Can the child's brain successfully accommodate multiple language systems early in life? Here's what happens with the brain. When you're born, let me pause for a second. When you're born, you have organs, right? And your heart is for pumping blood, and your lungs are for breathing, and your brain's for thinking. Well, that's obvious. However, it takes the brain many, many years to develop parts and systems that are specialized for different jobs. Reading, speaking, math, driving cars, all the things, right? This is why you have to wear a helmet when you're on a bicycle. You kind of need it because it's developing. And the way that it develops is on the left side, right behind your eyebrow, is the Broca's area. It helps you put sentences together. If you understand the sentences I'm speaking, you've got Broca's area and you understand how it works. However, when children begin their lives early in childhood, on both the right and the left sides, this part of the brain is helping them process these sentences and language in general. And eventually, for reasons that are partly biological, the left hemisphere takes over. And as I mentioned, it's partly biological. We think we're wired this way, that left hemisphere is preferentially for language. And look how it goes up here, this line from ages 6 to 18, we're becoming more and more left hemisphere dominant for processing language. However, is it all biology? Turns out no. So if we look at the children from higher and lower SES, and they're about 5 years of age, this left hemisphere dominance emerges earlier for children with from high SES. And people ask, how come? Well, high SES families, lots of books, verbal interactions, more resources. We think there's something in the environment. And other studies have now looked at kids who are from the same socioeconomic background, but have parents who spend more time talking to them. And they find the same effects. If you have a parent who is more likely to talk to the child, that child seems to have an acceleration in the development of the brain regions dedicated to language. Our lab's bilingual, and so obviously we had to ask, imagine learning 2 really complex language systems. Wouldn't that be a great exercise for the brain? What happens? Does this mean it holds back and delays brain development for language, or the opposite, right? Beefs up the process. And so to answer this question, whoa, these slides come. No, that means I clicked too hard. I'm sorry. Here comes this slide. So to answer this question, we worked with our colleagues here in Ann Arbor, Michigan, particularly Dr. Teresa Satterfield, who has built and established a Nuestra Lengua, a Saturday Spanish language school for heritage language speakers. And so the children go every Saturday for about 2 hours where they get a structured literacy instruction in Spanish. And so we bring these kids into the lab and we ask them to do a sentence listening task, right? Broca's areas for sentences. And we compared these kids to monolingual children who only speak English, and they had the same language proficiency and they were the same age. And what we find right here on the left side is that the bilingual kids activate this part of the brain, the left hemisphere Broca's area, more so than the monolingual children. What does it tell us? It tells us the brain is a muscle. If you like swimming or lifting weights, you're going to develop shoulder muscles. If you like jogging or long distance running, you're going to develop leg muscles. If you are learning multiple languages, you're going to develop brain muscles right here to process languages. So yes, languages are complicated, but it's an exercise, and children are developing the muscles of the brain. And importantly, it doesn't rain down all by itself. There's no miracles involved. There are hardworking teachers and educators and community leaders, such as my colleague, Dr. Teresa Satterfield, who build these schools and are offered to provide heritage language and literacy instruction in the community to literally build up the children's brain muscle for language processing. And so this is the slide I'm showing you now, is that are bilingual kids delayed? And the answer is no, they're not. Are they less proficient? The answer is they should have normative language development in their dominant language, right? So if the child's mostly hearing Spanish and using Spanish, they should have normative development in Spanish. If they're primarily using English, it should be normative there in English. And it's entirely possible, as we have just seen, for kids with 50-50 experience to have normative development in both languages. There are individual differences, again, based on the language usage or on the child's language ability, such as being at risk for language disorders. And these can and should be addressed with explicit instruction in core elements of language, including phonology, morphology, syntax, vocabulary, all the great things that teachers do and that you get to hear about during this conference. And brain development, you're literally building up the muscles that support language development through explicit dual language instruction. And with that, I turn to my colleague,
Yes.
Dr. Cárdenas-Hagan, who is
Thank
an
you.
expert and will tell more about language risks.
Thank you, Dr. Kovelman. Now, what I want to point out to you, remember the slide that Dr. Kovelman showed you, being brought up in that bilingual environment, 50-50 environment, showing that, oh my goodness, are these students delayed? Are these children delayed? No, they're meeting those language milestones. But Dr. Kovelman pointed out to you, oh, see the red dots? The red dots are students that have been identified and who are having these difficulties with language. And we call that now a developmental language disorder. You might have heard that described as DLD. And it is something that we see as a neurodevelopmental condition, and we see it very early. We've got to be able to identify these children early when they're not meeting the milestones like their peers, and this problem can persist throughout their academic careers and on into adulthood. So what are they going to have trouble with? They're going to have trouble understanding language and using language. And remember, language, right? Our oral language is listening and speaking, and our written language is reading and writing. So it's not unusual to have seen those red dots that Dr. Kovelman showed, because these are the children that struggle in language. Had they been exposed to, these opportunities you saw that she described, wow, when they get these opportunities, you see that language, those language centers of the brain really being very, approached in a manner in which they're developed. On the next slide, you'll see that and Dr. Kovelman already talked about Dr. Bador and Dr. Pena, who've done so much work in this area, but really looking at developmental language disorders and what should we be thinking about. And you out there, I often ask parents, when did you first suspect? And you know what they say? The kindergarten teacher told me, or the preschool teacher told me. That preschool teacher, that kindergarten teacher, they were right on the money, right? So what are we noticing here? What are the features to consider? Well, when we're diagnosing such a disorder, we have to make sure that we're looking within and across languages, and that we also understand what has been the context. Dr. Kovelman showed you the context. Oh, some will get 100% of these language, some will get 60-40, some will get 50-50. But have we been witnessing that limited vocabulary growth in the languages, especially in the languages where they're being instructed? Are they having these word finding difficulties across languages, right? And what we see too are these syntax errors. But you know that there's common syntax errors when you're going across languages. For example, in Spanish and English, I confuse. Where does my adjective go? Does it go before the noun or after the noun? Those are the types of errors that are very typical. But in students or individuals with developmental language disorders, these syntax errors that they have are not so typical, right? And then what you find is they're going to have not only that difficulty in syntax and really figuring out, but they also have trouble with that grammatical morphology, really thinking about the tense, that the morphemes can really change, the tense of the words, which then, how we use them when we're speaking in sentences. That's going to be very important. Dr. Kovelman's done some work on this morphosyntactic structures of language and looking at that also in the brain. But these are the things that we are finding that we are, for the bilingual students, we tend to be delayed in identifying these language issues, which are occurring very early for the fear of that over identification, which absolutely has to be considered. But, also we're seeing more of the under identification in more recent years. On the next slide, you'll see that when we look at developmental language disorders, it is reported about 7.5% of the population will have that, and that will not differ, right? So if I'm a Spanish speaker, an English speaker, a bilingual speaker, in each of these communities, it's about 7.5%, and not a big difference in the overall severity of these issues, right? Where we'll see is these differences perhaps in the vocabulary, and that also may have to do with the exposure and opportunities, but just know that vocabulary is resilient, and know that we can instruct these students, and know that we can get these gains. I'm a speech and language pathologist that works with individuals with developmental language disorders, and we can really affect and make that change with the help of you out there who are working perhaps in the general education classroom, or working in providing interventions, or providing very intense interventions, perhaps in special education. But what we need to make sure of is that we are providing very consistent, explicit instruction, that we are working collaboratively to make sure that we're looking at grammar and vocabulary, and we're looking at that dual language input, and that we're looking, don't be fearful to look across languages and to address and perhaps even do bilingual interventions. What's the fear? We have to address, if I'm in a bilingual environment, I can use those cross-language opportunities, and I can be effective with these students, not in one language, but in two languages. On the next slide, you'll see the at-risk measurement. And we've been really looking at this, and I'm pleased to tell you that through the work of many out there, but really looking at the challenges, when we are assessing individuals who are in bilingual environments and developing bilingually, we know that that can put a child at risk for that misidentification. I'm not saying that that risk doesn't exist. Absolutely it does. So that's why we have to have the professionals out there, and that's why we have to work collaboratively across our professions, across our expertise. But when we only use, you cannot only use one language assessment, right? Only in one language to look at a bilingual student, because you're missing the other half, the other piece of the puzzle. So we have to look across languages to ensure that we're not going to over-identify students with a developmental language disorder. But we also have the under-identification that, Connor and Paul Morgan, they talk about this a lot, that what happens is when they are under-identifying, we don't figure out this problem until second, third, fourth grade or so. We've missed an opportunity, a key opportunity for language development these early years, right? And we're missing that crucial window for that intervention. And what happens with the students, then we see the gap gets wider and wider. Now, I do have some good news for you. And the good news is this idea, like in speech and language, we have what we call conceptual scoring. And what that means is we now have assessments available that can look, across languages, such as the most prominent language of our multilingual learners is Spanish. Close to 80% of the students in our country speak Spanish as their home language. And so we have tools to look at language, to look at the vocabulary, to look at how they're, how they're responding, that we can look cross-linguistically. That is the future. That's where we're going, so that we are not only looking solely at one language, that we're looking across languages and getting what we call a bilingual score. That is what would be fair. And that's what we in speech language pathology do. And that's what we need to do across, even when we're thinking about literacy as well. All right. So you probably have heard Tiffany Hogan talk about DLD and me. She's been a real trooper for really promoting that we, and especially as we look at dyslexia, Dr. Hogan talks about, dyslexia and developmental language disorders and talks about the co-occurrence of that. And so at this DLD and me, you can find out a lot of just facts that would be so helpful for your schools, for your community, for your parents to really know that developmental language disorders exist. And as you saw Dr. Kovelman show you, when the children aren't making the progress like all the children do, it is likely that these children that aren't making those nice gains are likely at risk for having a developmental language disorder. What say you, Dr. Kovelman?
Thank you so much, Dr. Elsa Cardenas. We will now complete our portion on the language, and we're happy to come back to it should you be interested. Most importantly, Dr. Elsa Cardenas and I have a breakout session later today to focus on this. If you have questions on any of these elements and you want to talk to us more about this, if you don't get a chance now, please rejoin us after the sessions, or you can, of course, always email us. So as we move on, we're going to talk about reading, something I hear is the topic of these days' events. And reading, of course, we want to read text and we want to read stories and we want to read sentences, but we start with words, right? You get to kindergarten and maybe you know how to say cat, and maybe you know that it denotes a furry creature that says meow. And now you have to learn to read it, and it's C-A-T. And my child kept telling me, no, mother, it's K-A-T. And I would say, no, it's C-A-T, right? So now you're seeing how things are complicated, even for something as simple as spelling the word cat. So what we do as adult readers, we can all read this word, droplet. It's not a word, we just made it up. And then on the other side, we can also read there, and there. And they sound the same, but you know that they mean different things when you look at it. This means that we conceptualize of word reading as two interrelated, but still two big skills. One of them is the sound to print mapping, allowing us to read all sorts of new words, and meaning to print mapping, such as there and there and there. You're looking at a word form and you have to adjudicate which way it's going to fall. And cat is sort of in between, right? It's phonetic. It says C-A-T, but also you need to remember it's a cat and it's not a K-A-T. And we know that in languages such as Spanish, widely spoken in Latin America, and all over the world, it's one of the largest languages speaking communities, and in the United States, there's a lovely sound to letter correspondence, such as gato. You heard gato, you're going to spell gato. And on the other side of the spectrum are character-based languages such as Chinese, where they're really based on what we call morphemes. So they're closely associated with meaning. And that's something that we just know as we look across linguistic consequences of reading. But remember, we're talking about bilinguals, and we're also talking about kids who are heritage speakers of the language, right? So in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where I'm at, the schools are 100% English. The kids come, they get on the bus. On my kids, actually, I put my own child on a school bus this morning at 7:30. English begins, and the English will go on as they get off the bus at around 4 p.m., and then there's going to be homework. So all of that is in English, but at home, I speak Russian, and you at home may be speaking Chinese or Spanish or another wonderful language that the children are not learning to read in as extensively as in English. Does that make a difference? That's the question. Does it make a difference that you are speaking and reading a language at home with your child that is different from the one they're learning to read in English at school? And notice the word morphology. We're bravely going to step into it and talk about this for a moment. Morphology is really important. Yes, you may have heard about this in your grammar textbooks and assumed this is something, up there for the linguists. No, my friends. We use it every single day. We buy Lunchables for our kids, and we've learned to do contactless delivery during COVID. These are new words. A lot of the words we read, and many of the new words that children read, are made out of roots and suffixes and prefixes. So I can, all of us about 2 years ago came up with this word contactless. It's obvious what it means, and we put it together because it's made out of units that we know. And so the reason I'm showing it to you today is because that's really important. It permeates lives. That's how we make words. That's why children don't inherit language from their parents, right? We learn it from our parents because we change the language as we go. Morphology is the living, breathing blood of a living language, right? That's how we flow. And it's really important. And look at how cool it is in Chinese. We all know that phonological awareness tasks are telltale tasks for language and reading impairments in English. And so if children have difficulty rhyming, we know they may be at risk for reading impairments. However, if I were in China and I gathered a group of kids and I said, hi, we all know that apples grow on apple trees. What kind of trees do you think would grow bread? And I would expect the children to say bread trees. That's a task that elicits morphological awareness. And because in Chinese, the words map into character, apple tree, right, bread tree. So all of these are mapping onto characters rather than sounds. It's an important measure and it's an important construct for the very early steps of learning to read in Chinese. And I'm showing this to you now to visualize it on a graph. So we'll look at early grades in English, and 20% of variance, which is a big chunk of what supports children's reading, is phonological awareness, right? The rhyme judgment task, the sound segmentation abilities. Morphological awareness, by the way, take a look, not so bad, about 5%. So it's really important, which I also say. These are important skills, and it's going to gain in importance as you enter middle school. We'll look on the other side, and this is work by Cami McBride and others showing that in Chinese, it's almost the exact opposite. To learn the character, the meaning to character mapping, morphological awareness is your stepping stone. It's your stepping stone. And then the phonological awareness is not that big of a deal. But again, by the time kids reach middle school and higher grades, the phonology will grow in importance. So reading's universal, right? We all learn to read, and phonology and morphology matters for all of us. It's about what the stepping stone is. And so there are some differences in alphabetic languages with sound. We map sounds onto letters, K-A-T, and then we learn to make bread trees and apple trees through morphological awareness, so contactless, and that becomes progressively more important. And it's almost the opposite how we get started in Chinese. And now the question is, well, does any of this matter in the United States where we're all learning to read in English? Does any of this make a difference? Right now, you've learned something about reading in Chinese in case you didn't know, but do you really need this knowledge as you think about how the kids learn to read in English? Hence our question. How do bilingual kids learn to read, especially in environments with English dominant education and a different language at home? So to answer this question, we looked at Spanish English bilinguals and Chinese English bilinguals and English monolingual kids, and we looked at them twice, separated by about a year. And there's one important thing I want to tell you before I show you any of the data. We were interested, right? So we were interested in this triangle, sound meaning to print mapping. And we got these kids and we matched them on their word reading proficiency and their phonological awareness. So they're matched for their reading skills across those bilingual kids. So we won't be showing you a deficit model, right? None of these kids are doing worse than the others. They're all matched. The bilingual kids have bigger vocabularies than monolingual kids when taken across their languages, but when split in each, a little bit less, and that's typical of bilingual kids. That's how it rolls. And now we're ready to start asking questions. And the first question that we ask is, all right, so there's skills that kids have had on the first visit in their heritage language, phonological and morphological awareness in Spanish and Chinese. When we look at them a year later at time two in English for phonological and morphological awareness, did it make a difference? If they had really good phonology skills in Chinese or in Spanish at time one, does that make an impact on how they read in English in time two, even when we control for all these things in English at time one as well? And that's what we call bilingual direct transfer, right? Phonology to phonology, morphology to morphology, we call it direct transfer in bilingualism. Now you're learning something about bilingual science and how we measure things. And our second question, well, do these kids read differently? If we just look at time 2 with these blue dots here in English, phonology, morphology, word reading, and we compare Spanish, English, and Chinese bilinguals in English, and we ask, do these kids read differently in English? And these are, we think, are indirect effects, right, on how these kids are reading. And remember, they're matched. They're matched for phonology, morphology, and word reading. Now we're ready to take a look at the data. Here's what happens. Phonological awareness. Oh my goodness, there's such a strong association between learning how to rhyme and segment words and play all these sound games in Chinese and in Spanish to how these kids then can do this in English. And again, we're controlling for English language skills. So this is careful statistics here, but we know that if the kids can do these sound games at time 1 in their heritage language, they're going to do really well doing this at time 2, a year later in English. So there's a direct association. And that's easy. I can give you words in Russian, and if you can segment them into sounds, you can do this in any language. We think it's a language general skill. I just gave you the word froplet that doesn't exist in any language, but we can all segment it into sounds and tell you how many syllables there are. We think it's a language general skill, and it transfers easily. Let's look at morphology. Only in Spanish we see a solid association between morphological reading skills in Chinese at one point and then a year later in English. That makes a lot of sense. About 70% of the English and Spanish vocabulary are shared. There's lots of words that exist in both of these languages. And so knowing those roots and prefixes and suffixes in Spanish and how they go together, when you know them in Spanish, you can do this in English. There's a big, big transfer here. However, if you look at Chinese, and I've studied Chinese for about 2 years, there's only one word that exists in both Russian and Chinese, and the word is chai. And it means tea, and it's a borrowing from the Indian language. That's not even native to either Chinese or Russian. So with this one word, right, we can't really associate things easily. So this we call a direct transfer. Some skills we call them language general, such as phonology, and some skills we call them language specific, such as morphology. And it's terrific that the Spanish-speaking kids, and as well as kids speaking lots of other languages that share words with English, can do these direct transfers. And so it's wonderful to be able to support that. As Dr. Elsa Cárdenas-Hagan had mentioned, 80% of our bilingual speakers in this country are Spanish speakers, and they know how to make complex words, right? Think of the words like aquatic, right? Agua is water in Spanish. If you can support their vocabulary and morphological learning in Spanish, this will support their English. Now, enough of that, and we're going to turn to question 2. Is there a difference in how these kids read? Now we're going to look just on the right side of the screen for the blue things. Here's what we find out. In English, Spanish-speaking bilinguals make greater use of phonological skills for word reading than either English speakers or Chinese speakers. This makes sense. Remember, words like gato, you hear gato, you spell gato. And then in English, it's progressively more difficult and even more difficult in Chinese. And so the kinds of skills these heritage language speakers are picking up in their home language, it's buying them those literacy skills in English. Even though we're just looking at English, right? I'm not showing you Spanish or Chinese here. This is just these kids in English. Let's look at morphology. Remarkable. Our Chinese-speaking children are placing greater reliance on morphological skills when reading words in English. And remember, this is called indirect transfer because chai is the only word that they can logically take from one to the other language. But yet the skill of hearing a word and breaking into pieces and finding those pieces on a printed page, they can transfer that from one language to the other. And most importantly, my friends, I keep reminding everybody, our kids are matched for phonological awareness, morphological awareness, and word reading skills. For the skills itself, they are identical. And if I put 3 children in front of you, one a Chinese speaker, one a Spanish speaker, one a monolingual English speaker, all going to a school here in Michigan, they would have the identical reading skills. But what I'm telling you is they read differently. because heritage language matters, it changes, it has a positive influence on how these kids beef up their individual reading skills. Why do we do this and why do we discuss it? What's in a word? You can hear my Russian accent. Guess what? That's because I have language 1, which is Russian, and language 2, which is English. I take skills from my home language, my first language, language in which I learned to read and to speak first, and I drag it over to English. And so it's inefficient, and that's how I read and that's how I speak. And that's what happens to a lot of adults. Children, on the other hand, do not have an L1 and L2 in a canonical sense. They have one language and another language. We call it dual language acquisition system. They go between schools and families and communities using these two languages, and it's integrated for them. These two languages, not like one is on the left hemisphere and the other one's on the right. No, they're together. They occupy the exact same parts of the brain, the exact same parts of the system. They're talking to each other. They're integrated. This means if you can only offer literacy or intervention in one language, that would still support the other language. Ideally, you want to offer it in both, but they're talking to each other. Remember, these languages are talking to each other. So the takeaway messages we take from here is that literacy instruction buys you the reading brain. Heritage language and literacy schooling, family and community support, they will boost brain development for language. They will boost heritage language literacy assets to reciprocally support bilingual oral and written language skills across both languages. We talked about words. Knowing words in one language will help you knowing words in these languages. Knowing phonological awareness in one language will help you do better on phonological skills in the other language, right? They're reciprocal and they boost both languages. And you need explicit and systematic literacy instruction. When I tell you about the children that we study, these are the children who attend heritage language schools who've been put together by the community leaders in Michigan. Again, our instruction is in English in the public schools. So they get these heritage language skills from their families who take time to do homework with them in the heritage language, and the community leaders who've built heritage language schools that allow them to get some instruction, usually just on the weekends, maybe only 2 hours a week. And this helps build literacy skills and reading brain neurocircuits. It's essential for neurodiverse learners that they receive structured literacy instruction in at least one of their languages, ideally for both. And it helps the kids build those bridges between spoken and printed languages to improve both. So for more on the details on this, I turn your attention to Dr. Elsa Cárdenas-Hagan.
Thank you so much. Isn't it amazing to see the work of Dr. Kovelman and all her colleagues to show just such an advantage for these students that have these opportunities for more than one language. And so and you saw the importance of that bilingual language development and that literacy instruction. Dr. Kovelman mentions that being very explicit and systematic, right? She also talked about morphology and how, there's so much of that morphology. And you saw how those Spanish speakers really took advantage of that morphology. They took advantage of the phonology, the Chinese speakers really taking advantage of the morphology. But what I want to tell you is that the majority of students in our country are not having that opportunity to be developing, biliteracy and bilingualism, or multiliteracy or multilingualism. So what we know is we are finding that students primarily, like Dr. Kovelman described, they're learning English language and English literacy in school. They may be speaking their heritage language in that home environment, right? And so what she talks about is the need for that explicit instruction, right? But what we want to also talk about are the features of cross-linguistic features that should be taught. So there's a lot of the English language that we can take advantage in languages that are alphabetic. Dr. Kovelman showed you on languages that are more logographic, right? Chinese, right? That, those connector points are going to be less, but you know what? They're still using that morphological awareness for that English language. And so here I give you the example that 19 sounds of the Spanish language directly transferred to the English language. The English language has 44 sounds. That's a lot of sounds, right? And in my work, I have found that there's a minimum of 65 morphemes that directly transfer, meaning that, oh, they are, and when I say directly transfer, I don't mean in how you say them, but I mean in how they look and how they're spelled. We have others that maybe there's a slight difference in the spelling and, of course, in the pronunciation, but the meaning is the same. So what we have to take advantage of is for, you saw that phonological, if I have that phonological ability in my home language of Spanish, that's going to really help my English. If I have a wonderful vocabulary in my home language and you actually taught me how to play with words and build them from those morphemes, I'm going to use that knowledge for my English language and my English language vocabulary, right? And what we see also is looking at that syntax, that there's some similarities, for example, the grammatical features, especially between Spanish and English, right? But we have differences in word order and how we use that. And of course, the complexity varies, that grammatical complexity. And that's something that we need to very clearly address as we work with students in that. But first, we, as the educators, as the therapists out there, as the interventionists, we have to know this to do right by these students. And we have to teach them this metalinguistic ability. So that's why we have to be explicit and systematic in our approach so that the students can generalize and start to use this knowledge as they come across new words that they don't know, that they're using these structures to learn the new language. On the next slide, you'll see that I want you also to know, you'll go back to the green. I want you to see that a lot of people know that, oh, when I ask teachers, do you know about the National Reading Panel report? And, many teachers will raise their hand, but they won't raise their hand when I ask them, do you know that we have a National Literacy Panel report on language minority children and youth? Which, yes, it identifies these key features that Dr. Kovelman has been talking to you about, that phonological awareness, that morphological awareness. And then we use that knowledge for building that phonics knowledge, to build that fluency that, very clearly morphology helps us in vocabulary. But what do we need to do that's different for our students who have a home language that is not the same as our English language in this country? So we're going to use those skills of their home language, their heritage language, for their knowledge of second language and second language literacy. And that means going from that home language, for example, of Spanish to English, right? And or it could be going from Arabic and English, another common language, or Vietnamese and English, or Russian and English. And you saw Dr. Kovelman show you, wow, look at Russian and look at those, key connections and phonological awareness across the languages. So what you need to know is that in these national meta-analyses reports, finding that students that have this home language, this heritage language, and have that ability in their home language, they're going to perform higher in English literacy than if you only instructed them in one language, that second language. So remember what I'm telling you. In our country, we are primarily teaching these students English as a second language. But what this meta-analysis is showing is that, when you're looking at them building these languages, they're going to do better. So that's also what Dr. Kovelman was talking about, this dual language brain, and that it's not two different brains. It's this brain and these centers doing all these different connections and going across these different highways, right? And making these connections very amazingly. On the next slide, you'll see the report of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, right? This was done in 2017. It's another meta-analysis looking at how can we promote the educational success of children and youth that are learning English as an additional language. And you'll see there that some of the same kinds of features that you saw in that earlier National Literacy Panel report are right here in this consensus study report, looking at developing that explicit instruction in the literacy by looking at that phoneme awareness, by looking at, can we capitalize on some of those phonics knowledge? Can we work on that fluency? And very clearly, there's connections in vocabulary, reading comprehension. And this National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine report adds writing to it. Very important, because listening, speaking, reading, and writing, key. So it's up to you to really learn about, what do we know? What does the science tell us? Dr. Kovelman is very much giving you what we know from the brain science, but you also have to know about how we get that brain science into the practice of what we're doing. And these national reports give you that information. On the next slide, you'll see that the guidelines, what does this report say? That you must be explicit in your instruction in these literacy components, and that you must be a language teacher as you are a literacy teacher. And that not only means in language arts, but across the day when I'm teaching science or social studies, etc. Mathematics has language. We know that our students need that language support, and that we need to give them those verbal supports, and we use visuals to help that core content to be very much helpful in comprehending. But when students get the opportunity to work with each other in these peer-assisted learning opportunities, we get a lot of nice results. So what we're asking you to do is capitalize on those connections between the home language and the second language. Understand their language, know your students, understand their language, understand their background, understand their cultural assets, and really make sure that you're developing language as you're developing literacy. And we know many states have screening across this country. In my state of Texas, we designed the first screeners in 1998. Now we are in 2024. We have been using screeners from 1998 to 2024. All right. And we've been screening for these language and literacy challenges. And I want to tell you, we have not over-identified students with dyslexia. In fact, only about 4% of the population in Texas of English learners are identified with dyslexia, right? And that's not quite at looking at the prevalence of dyslexia. Now, we've also worked from 1998 to 2024 on structured literacy instruction for all children in our state. So it may be that the structured literacy instruction has helped that. We don't know the why behind what we're finding yet. But what we do know is the screeners are used to teach, and that we're not using them to clearly identify dyslexia, and we have not over-identified dyslexia from 1998 to 2024. And we have 1 million students who are learning English as an additional language in our state, similar to your state of California, one of the largest states with the most multilingual students than all the other states, right? And between Texas and California, we have almost 50% or about 50% of these students for our country. So that's why you must know how to develop the language and how to give them that language support and the literacy support each and every day. And it's very important for you to know, what does the science tell us? And here I'm providing you with the science and what it tells us up to today. On the next slide, you'll find another these are called the literacy briefs. And this has been about 10 years of work. And I had the opportunity to be on the, final 5 years of this work, what we call the model demonstration projects. I actually am involved in one right now called a model demonstration project for dyslexia. And what you see here is looking at the multilingual students. This one was the mtss4ls.org. That's the website. These projects are completed. However, it's telling us how we have to differentiate our language and literacy teaching and scaffold for these students from these linguistically diverse backgrounds. And that's up to us to know those connections for us to make and to bring in those culturally relevant principles. What does that do? Does that teach me to read? No, but it gets me engaged. It gets me motivated. And it gives me that that I matter in your classroom. That's all I ever wanted as a little girl, to know that I mattered and that my language mattered. And that we should have been using my home language to teach me this new English language. And I didn't have to guess at what these words were or meant because I already had some home language resources that I could have used for second language. And unfortunately, I didn't know about this until I was an adult. And so let's give this gift to the young students that we have in front of us today. But first, you have to have that educator knowledge of what do we know. And this website will help you to determine this 10 years of work. On the next slide, you have a QR code, and that's going to give you a little bit of access to these research reports. So we are giving you homework. Go and read, go and really know your stuff. Know it backwards and forwards. All right, we'll move on. And so I want to just talk to you about some final thoughts. As you saw Dr. Kovelman talk about, she talked about that early exposure to more than one language and the benefits. She talked to you about how our brain, the human species, we are meant to be multilingual. We are pre-wired to speak all the languages of the world. But as we are only exposed to one or two, then we really specialize in that. And so that's going to be very important that we really promote that multilingualism. We also talked about students at risk for developmental language disorders and that they can be screened and we can gather information from our families about the individuals that are in front of us and whether in fact they should be referred to a specialist such as a speech and language pathologist to screen or evaluate for this developmental language disorder, because the earlier we intervene, the better the outcomes that we'll get in language and in literacy. That early exposure, that early opportunity for having that structured literacy and taking it from a structured multi-literacy perspective, that's really going to help our students. And that's up to us to know how we can take advantage of those cross-linguistic transfers. They have positive effects for language and literacy. And students that have, I want to dispel a myth out there for those of you that work specifically with students with dyslexia, is to think that they cannot be biliterate. I want to tell you, where I live along the Texas and Mexico border, the students with dyslexia that we serve in our community come out biliterate. And that's because we work in their home language and the second language, and we treat them in the dyslexia remediation in a cross-linguistic, cross-language format so that these students can achieve not in one language or two languages. Do not sell our students with dyslexia short that they cannot do this, because they can. And specifically too, if they have other disabilities that we know of because they co-occur, such as a developmental language disorder, when we get that early intervention, then we're going to help them in their language and their literacy so that they can overachieve. On the next slide, you'll see the questions that we asked today. Are bilingual kids or students delayed in learning to speak and to read? What did Dr. Kovelman show you? No, no, no. She said it very clearly. We saw it in the research studies. We saw it in the brain studies. You are not delayed in learning to speak and to read. And how do we identify a bilingual student with a language or reading deficit? We cannot solely look at one language. We have to look across languages. And if we only looked at one language, then we have an incomplete picture. We don't know the total picture. And that's why we're excited about this conceptual scoring and excited about the potential of AI to help us, move that along a little bit quicker in this whole literacy domain. And so to make it easier for you to see, oh, this is that bilingual score. Let's really look across those languages and give credit for language and literacy across languages. How can we best support our students who are bilingual and that they have these learning deficits? what you have to know is that you're a language professional, you're a language teacher, and that you're going to always be bringing in those scaffolds for language. You're going to help the students by bringing those visual supports, some of those graphic organizers to help them. And you're going to be making those connections across the language, right? And as we look at what language environment is best for supporting bilingualism, Dr. Kovelman showed you, those national reports show you, we can do this. Having that opportunity to be learning in more than one language, language and literacy in 2 languages, it can happen. It can happen. That National Literacy Panel report showed you for the language minority children and youth showed you that these students who had that opportunity for home language literacy, home language development, they did better in their English literacy than those who were taught in English only. And our country is really teaching in English as a second language, the majority of these kids. And so the more we think about and really challenge ourselves to how we can deliver this bilingual, dual language kind of environment, the better for the students that we serve. So as we think about this, you have Dr. Kovelman's a website and email. You have my website and email. And we hope today that you've seen what that gift of biliteracy or multiliteracy can be and how we should all challenge ourselves to be multiliterate. And that really is such a cognitive advantage. Dr. Kovelman, over to you for your last words. We have about a minute left.
Here we are on time. We have so Dr. Elsa Cárdenas-Hagan and I have posted some slides for you on the resources. And so you can access this after, and this will be also, the talk will be posted. You can contact us. So please make use of these resources. Of course, on our end, we acknowledge the research assistants and the speech therapists and the literacy experts and our funding agencies and the community heritage language schools. The list would go on and on and on and on and on, would be the length of the state of Texas. But just very briefly, and Michigan combined, that we are grateful for all the support and all of you attending and being here today. And we thank you for supporting all those learners in your classrooms, in your communities, in your homes, wherever they're at. We have shown you these 2 different perspectives where you have Texas, where there's lots and lots of opportunities, and Michigan, which is more limited, but and look how well they do. And I believe the new speaker is being keyed up for the, so we wish you all much success in supporting bilingual kids who are at risk for learning disabilities. As we have heard today, they can. All children can be readers. All children can be
Thank you so
successful
much.
readers.
Wow. Thank you so much, Yulia and Elsa. That was amazing. You have given us so much to think about, and you are, in fact, a dynamic duo. Not only did you give us lots to think about, Elsa gave us some homework, so that's exciting. The importance of building up brain muscles for language processing. Vocabulary is resilient. The importance of getting the big picture, and that language and literacy support each and every day is so critical. So much to think about it. So now it is my absolute great pleasure to introduce our surprise speaker, who we are so pleased to have you here, State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Tony Thurmond, and he has some welcoming remarks for our audience.
Thank you, Tammy. Thank you to everyone at the California Dyslexia Initiative. And thank you to everyone who is on today to enjoy this great capacity building opportunity. It's my pleasure to bring you greetings on behalf of the California Department of Education here in the state capitol. I am hopeful because it was just a year ago that people were debating a bill like SB 114 that would create universal and broad access to dyslexia screening. And now that is not only the law, but we're on our way to being able to provide dyslexia screening for students. And we have the resources and the ability to do it in many languages, in English, in Spanish, I understand soon in Mandarin, and perhaps in other languages. I want to say thanks to everyone at the California Department of Education for your work. I want to say thanks to everyone at our Sacramento County Office of Education. I want to thank our two literacy directors, who you may hear from today, and Cheryl Cotton, who I know who's been on this Zoom. I am hopeful, even though we know that by today's standards, 70% of those who are incarcerated in this state can't read or have experienced some learning disability or reading disability. I am hopeful that this is a trend that we can change through dyslexia screening and through the work of the literacy roadmap that you'll hear about shortly. California has all the key resources to make sure that any student who struggles with a reading struggles or dyslexia or any other learning difficulties can have the support that they need. And we have the tools to make sure that every child can learn to read by third grade and beyond. We have the resources to make sure that our students are able to learn to read and write in more than one language. And so we talk about literacy and biliteracy in the state, and we're proud of it. And there are great resources here, not the least of which is the ELA-ELD framework, which lays out how we help students of all backgrounds to get to literacy by third grade and beyond. We have the Reading Coaches and Specialist grants. And we are hopeful that in the near future, we will be able to provide professional development for more than 160,000 folks and educators who help our children learn how to read, to have access to some of the top quality programs in helping our students learn how to read. And so for all the presenters, for all the participants, for all who helped to convene, I say to you, thank you for giving us hope for where we can get as it relates to helping to change the trends around those who experience reading difficulties and dyslexia. Look forward to what comes out of these days in the conference and our continued partnership. And thank you for being a part of California's Dyslexia Initiative. Take care.
Thank you so much, Superintendent Thurmond. I love the theme of hope. I too am hopeful. We have a lot of projects and work going on across California dedicated to improving outcomes for our students. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. Well, before you go off to your sessions today, just a reminder that if you made your breakout selections and built your schedule on the platform, you can navigate to them through the Your Schedule links on the homepage or the sessions link in the left menu. And you did hear Superintendent mention the literacy roadmap. That is, Bonnie Garcia and Nancy Brennelson will be sharing some information in one of the breakouts about that. Be sure you visit our amazing vendors. Look for the Easter eggs in the Play to Win challenge, and we'll be giving out raffle prizes throughout the day, courtesy of all of our generous vendors. Today's Show Us Your Smile winner for the $200 gift card, courtesy of American College of Education, was Cindy Bray. Congratulations, Cindy. Good job. And everyone, please join us back here at 3:15 for closing remarks after the breakout sessions. And if you do need a certificate of attendance, if you complete the 2024 end of conference event survey, you will be able to find a place to get that certificate in the left menu. And they're emailed to you by the end of the week. All right, for those of you waiting for a gamification code, it is multilingual, so that you can enter that in the Keynote Day 2 challenge. Breakout sessions start at 10, so please enjoy, and we'll see you back here at 3:15. Thank you. Bye-bye.